I would like to welcome you to panel number 2, Lockout, Limiting Youth's Access to Firearms. And again, we have a very esteemed panel of scholars, practitioners, advocates, and legislators. And so I will allow our panel to introduce themselves. Again,
Good morning again. I am Tyreese McAllister. I am a survivor. I am a therapist. I am the co-founder of Ayana J. McAllister Legacy Foundation, and I am also a member of Moms and the Survivor Network with Everytown.
Hi everyone, Bianca Bersani. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland. I also direct the Maryland Crime Research and Innovation Center. The center was started a couple of years ago by the Maryland Governor's Office. And the whole purpose, or the work that we do, is to work with jurisdictions, local communities, to help them address their public safety issues. So we are a research partner with these communities and jurisdictions. I think the Congressman talked about our embedded analyst program. We have some of our stellar students, one of which is in the audience, Tyreese, who work, we've had them embedded in the Baltimore Police Department for a couple of years, and we are excited about this new initiative with the Prince George's Police Department to help facilitate research and data analysis.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Lindsay Nichols. I'm the Policy Director at the GIFFORDS Law Center. So as you may know, Gabby Giffords was the former congresswoman who was shot in 2011. She joined her organization with a small legal organization that focused on gun safety to form GIFFORDS. And then we together, and I belong to this smaller organization, then we together, we worked to expand our work to cover all the forms of gun violence and all the possible solutions. In 2022, the organization formed the GIFFORDS Center for Violence Intervention, which really focuses on violence supporting and furthering violence intervention programs. So I'm very excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jolene Ivey. I'm chair of the Prince George's County Council, and also married to this young man for the past 35 years. We have 5 beautiful sons, and he also has a brilliant and beautiful daughter. And I really have put a lot of effort over the years into trying to help struggling families. I think that if we can just help people have easier lives, they can be better parents, they will raise children who will do better in school, and they will turn out to be stronger taxpayers. And they will also, of course, not resort to violence. And that's what we're here about today. So thank you for coming out, your interest, your advocacy, and all that you're doing for the survivors of gun violence.
I'm Jolene's husband.
no introduction needed. I just want to tee up this conversation with an article I recently read where Police Chief Malik Aziz was interviewed by the Washington Post, and there were some numbers that he mentioned during that interview that were quite startling. In 2023, there were 88 young people under the age of 18 arrested for gun possession. 21 of those out of that 88 were for ghost guns. 11 juveniles were killed in 2023. I believe 8 were arrested and charged. And there were far more young people under the age of 18 who were arrested for carjacking than adults in Prince George's County. And that's not just in Prince George's County, that's in Washington, D.C. as well. And so I want to start this conversation directing this question to you, Professor Bersani. What are some of the root causes of gun violence in communities, and what are some of the factors that make an individual more crime averse?
All right, so it's a good question. Stereotypical academic, I have my notes here to make sure I don't go too over time because we could spend hours speaking about this. But so I think when we are looking at the root causes of violence, thinking about the distribution of these incidents in our communities tells us a lot. Because Closer? Ooh, okay, try to speak closer. So violence is not randomly distributed throughout our community. We all know this. Instead, it occurs in places that have been persistently plagued by disinvestment, inequitable and under-resourcing, and extreme poverty. These contexts have been characterized as disorganized and lacking informal sources of social control that would come from different people and social institutions. These conditions breed situations, some of which you heard about in the first panel, that make conditions for violence more conducive. Therefore, simply living in these communities exposes individuals to violent opportunities, either as perpetrator, victim, or witness. Another aspect, though, of this clustering of crime and violent incidents in our communities speaks to the salience of social context and the confluence of these conditions for violence. So though we see year-to-year variation in the number of incidents that are occurring, with some years having many more violent encounters than others, what we see consistently over time is that the places that experience these events remains relatively consistent. This is regardless of the different people that might move in and out of these spaces. So it really shines a light on the focus of social context. We looked briefly at the data. I think many of you who are familiar with the county would be able to point at some of these places on a map. But we have seen that over the last 5 years, these concentrations of violence, particularly along the southeast border with DC, have become even more concentrated. Recognizing that violence and social contexts are inextricably linked means that the strategies that focus solely on people who are most at risk for violence, or efforts to bar access to guns and the like, are entirely important and necessary, but they're only a piece of this complex puzzle. If we want a goal of lasting and sustained change, these strategies need to be coupled with efforts that look at the root causes of crime, which are found in the local and the social context. And so we've seen efforts that are place-based, urban greening efforts, vacancy remediation. It was a topic of conversation in the first panel, support for local community organizations that know the intimate challenges of these communities and can help address the specific needs as needed, as well as funding for infrastructure support and to enhance mechanisms of informal social control, investing in our schools, which I think is a topic of conversation a bit later. Yeah, so I didn't mention I'm a life course criminologist, so I think about factors that occur from childhood, adolescence, and adulthood that influence both an individual's likelihood to engage in crime and violence, as well as to desist and to not engage. So I think it's really important that we think about, when we get into this, to recognize the nature of general youth development. I'm cutting out a ton of nuance here, but in a nutshell, the time in the life course of adolescence is characterized by dramatic developmental change. One of these changes involves the development of our internal restraint mechanism, so our braking system in our brain that tells us to pause and stop before we act. This means that adolescents are much more likely to act on impulse, but impulsivity is more likely to occur in what we think of as hot situations, or these emotionally charged situations, and when youth are around their peers. This tendency to act more impulsively is part of the reason why we see lethality of guns increase among youth. So while youth undergo this erratic developmental change and have a tendency to act more impulsively, including engaging in risky behavior, there are a couple of factors that we see that really help, and I'm just going to speak to two because I know I'm running long on time. First, individuals, and particularly youth who have strong bonds to their community, family, and schools, are less likely to engage in risky behavior. If youth engage in risky behavior, we know that this is actually a part of normal adolescent development. When they're bonded, their behavior tends to be of a less serious nature. Second, youth who are busy are less likely to engage in risky behavior, specifically when they're engaged in activities that are supervised and structured. So importantly, this requires that there are these activities in communities and that youth are able to access them safely. When we go around to community members and we speak to them, one of the things we hear commonly is that the kids have nothing to do. There's not enough activities and organizations, particularly in the after-school hours. But another key piece is safe access to those activities so that they can get from their homes or their schools to take advantage of those. We need to work on that. Combined, this means that violence reduction strategy should focus on things that build these bonds to school and other social institutions, provide these opportunities to structure their time, particularly in adolescence, and hopefully those will be linked to longer life course outcomes. You don't switch from being an adolescent to an adult at the turn of your birthday at 18. And increasingly we're finding that development that we have long thought about as characterizing adolescence is continuing well into the 20s, right? So this period of emergent adulthood, they're putting it at roughly 18 to 24, 26 years of age. And it's really where we're seeing, cognitive development still increasing. That rationality, that breaking on our impulses is developing for everyone. It's just many of our youth in society are in contexts and situations where they have more structure and they're restrained from acting on those impulses in informal ways. We're seeing a lack of those things in communities, particularly those that are impacted by violence. And so there's not that same social safety net there to help them as they're navigating these tough waters. I think the justice system, though, we're seeing it pop up in places where they're starting, if you Google emerging adult justice, there's a learning community that took place a couple of years ago. We're starting to see different strategies, raising the age in some jurisdictions. So in Vermont, the age of juvenile jurisdiction is 19. It's on the books to raise that to 20 years of age. Legislation similarly is going through Massachusetts and other states across the country. But we're seeing things like emerging adult courts or emerging adult corrections that are taking this differential development seriously and thinking about what we need to do for this age group to help them make a transition back into the community and to be productive.
I'd say, number one, we just have too many guns, right? There are too many guns in our community. So the thing that we can do and have done to try to reduce the number of guns, first, of course, we need help from Congress, which means really the Republicans have to have a come to Jesus moment because they have not been helpful. What we've done in Prince George's County, I know in November, for the second year in a row, First Baptist Church of Glenarden, together with Zion Church, did a huge gun buyback, and they were able to get hundreds of guns off the street. They work with our police department, and it's been 2 years running. So that kind of thing helps, because if the biggest problem is kids who don't have impulse control get access to a gun, they used to just eat each other up or toilet paper a tree, and now they get a gun and they shoot someone. And so we need to get the guns off the street, get them out of the hands of children, and get them out of the hands of, well, to me, pretty much everyone. But so gun buybacks help, Congress would help, and there are just so many things that we can do to reduce guns and reduce the access to guns. I know that President Biden was just announcing actions he's taken when it comes to locking up guns so that people, if they have one in their home, that it's kept more safely. I know that part of the problem we've had too is if you know that someone in your family is having a mental health problem and they have a gun, we have red flag laws in Maryland to make sure that you can actually report that person and have their gun taken away. That seems to impact the suicide rate more than anything else. But I was with a good girlfriend the night that her husband came under the door of a public restroom and beat the crap out of her and was taken to the hospital in an ambulance, and that's where I connected with her. And when they released her in the middle of the night, I drove her to Upper Marlboro where she pressed charges. I was very proud of her. And she also filled out the form so that they would know he had a gun, and they went by and picked it up. So that kind of action really helps keep the guns out of the hands of anyone who really should not have a gun. And those are some of the things that are happening locally.
I say this often, that a lot of times people are menacing, we ask them to put down the guns, but they need to be able to pick up a paycheck. And also parents need a livable wage. Sometimes these young people are unsupervised because the parents have jobs that they have to go to, and so even resources that would help with aftercare past 12 years old. So at 12 years old, I was unsupervised. What did I do? Everything my mother didn't want me to do. And that's real for our children too. Literacy issues and academic support, those are pathways, when children are illiterate, those are pathways to violent behavior and acting out. In-school support and out-of-school support, one of the things that is an issue is that some children have guns because they don't feel safe. They don't mean to menace, but if everybody else has a gun, then they get a gun to also then feel safe. But what happens is what Dr. Bersani was talking about, in that you have poor impulse control and you actually have access to a weapon. We also talk about the access to a weapon, and we only really talk about the gun laws when we talk about access to a weapon. But if we're honest with ourselves, most of the children and young people who have these guns didn't go to Walmart to purchase them. These guns are gotten illegally, so that our conversation for our community really has to be different and not as heavy on the gun laws, right? The gun laws, they definitely have a place and we should talk about them, but honestly, our young people are getting guns illegally, so the laws really don't make a difference. And dangerous people do not care about laws. We have to work on the impulse control, refusal skills, conflict resolution, and those types of things need to be taught in the school system as well. I mean, an entire class, because even when children aren't using guns, they're fighting, they're stabbing, they're doing some other things that are just as dangerous. We're focusing on guns, but it's really the level of violence. We also need to address, like I'll say it again, the ACEs. Why are our children so violent? What else is going on? We have to normalize getting help. Therapy, of course, I'm gonna say this because I'm a therapist, but we have to normalize not being okay is okay, and that there's help out there for you, because treatment actually does work, and it works very well. So some other things like social emotional learning and some cognitive behavioral therapy are also amazing things that will help us see a reduction in violence and will serve as great prevention measures. Well, as adults, we have to be more responsible, also not leave our children. I mean, social media can be dangerous. It can be helpful and useful, but it also can be dangerous, and so parents really have to parent and be more involved and have conversations with their children. There are a lot of parents who don't even know that their children have social media, or that they're not what they're looking at on social media. Social media can be a gateway for a lot of things in addition to violence, but also sex trafficking, sexual abuse, bullying. So we definitely parents have to be more responsible and monitor their children. And it's work, but I mean, parenting is a job.
Well, there is a variety of bills that have been introduced in Congress that would tackle the gun violence problem from a variety of approaches. One first bill that I want to highlight is Congressman Ivey's bill, the Raise the Age bill, that would close a loophole that allows guns, particularly rifles, to end up in the hands of people who are emerging adults. They are under age 21. So that bill, in conjunction with the background check requirement, would close these loopholes that are making it too easy for guns to flow into our communities. But we really do need a comprehensive approach. So we strongly support and advocate for federal investment in community violence intervention programs. As Greg mentioned earlier, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act began a substantial investment in those programs, but we need to build off of that. The funding that exists now primarily comes through the Department of Justice, but we all know that community violence is a public health problem. So what we really need is Congress to pass laws that create similar programs coming out of Health and Human Services. There is a bill by Congressman Horsford called the Break the Cycle of Violence Act that would establish that kind of program in HHS, and also fund programs through the Department of Labor, the kind of workforce development programs that we know could be really successful at keeping young people busy and productive and giving them a path forward for their lives. Another bill I wanted to highlight is Congressman Danny Davis's bill that would fund these community violence intervention programs in a way that will be sustainable, really create a sustainable funding stream through tax dollars. It's actually based on a groundbreaking law that California passed this year, AB 28, that would tax the gun manufacturers and use that funding to support these fantastic programs that we know can reduce gun violence and have been based on evidence and proven time and time again to focus on those who are at the highest risk of violence and intervene in such a way that people can become more engaged in their communities. Maryland actually has a bill that would replicate this model in the Maryland state legislature. The final bill on this topic I want to mention is Congresswoman Joanna Hayes' bill that would focus on school violence intervention programs. And so these kinds of programs are those that provide mentoring, after-school programs, the kind of programs that really focus on that early intervention for youth. As far as the gun industry question, we do see time and time again that the gun industry is really taking advantage of the fear and anxiety that our youth feel to profit, to sell guns. Unfortunately, there's a federal law called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act that protects the gun industry from civil litigation. So that means that a gun violence survivor whose tragedy was caused by harm from the gun industry cannot sue them. They can't present their evidence in court because of that immunity. There is a bill by Congressman Schiff that would repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. So repealing that immunity is the best thing that Congress should do. But even in the face of that law, state legislators can actually take action to provide a path forward so that the courtroom doors are not closed, gun violence survivors have access to justice, and the gun industry can be held accountable. That state level action has already been taken by 8 states and is currently pending in the Maryland State Legislature as SB 488.
For a lot of these scenarios, there are services that are available after a criminal act has been committed that are not available before. Just one real quick story. There's this program up in Baltimore that was doing outstanding work. I forget what it was called, but it was teaching kids about sailing and the like. And I met one of the kids. He was taking us around on the tour. This is actually the last place that the President and Vice President of the United States had ever been together at the same time. It was Clinton and Gore, and 9/11 happened after that. And after that, they never let them come to the same places again. But they both came to this place. The guy who's taking me on tour, I said, well, what did you do to end up in here? And he said, I started stealing cars. And I said, well, why are you stealing cars? And he said, I had a buddy who was in this program, and I saw that it was helping him, so I tried to join it, but they wouldn't let me in unless I had committed a criminal act and came in through the criminal justice, because you had to be assigned by a judge, right? We've got to find a way to get the resources to the kids who need it in a better way than that.
We also expect teachers to teach 30 and 40 children at one time and notice that something is wrong, right? Like the classrooms really have to be reduced. And then I know with our law enforcement is really, really short, but they have some amazing programs that are giving incentives. I know DC Police Department is giving $25,000 signing bonus. I even myself have thought about, well, maybe I can do that, right? And so, but I'm not understanding with the shortage of teachers, why haven't we invested, like we really don't And I think the police need it, do not get me wrong, I love that they're doing that for that police department. However, I'm just appalled that nobody is doing that for our educators,
Yes.
because they really are. When COVID occurred and my child was an adult, because if I had to stay home and teach her, then I think it would have been a different story. And I think most parents feel like that. Like when you got to stay home with your children, you realize how special and amazing teachers are to teach 30 or 40 at a time. We gotta do better by our educators, but we gotta equip them too, because it is very easy to see Johnny is a bad kid, but you don't realize that Johnny stayed up all night playing his game, and so he's acting out because he's tired, or because Johnny's dad didn't come home, or Johnny's dad got arrested, and Johnny is just acting out, he's grieving, but we just see Johnny as a bad kid. We need to throw on some ADHD medicine. But if we can train our educators to be able to see it a little differently. So I do this training with trauma-informed classroom, and it really is amazing, and teachers are being able to deal with the children differently, because now they know the right questions to ask to be able to provide that support. What Dr. Bersani had said earlier, like these things are clustered, right? So we know what's going on, and so you have Johnny and Johnny's 10 friends acting out in the classroom, and we expect the teacher to teach all 30 of them, plus Johnny and his 10 friends that are acting out. And so the child who is doing good or trying to do good, it's very hard for them to do good because you have all of these other distractions.
I mean, I think they need to be brought in, and I know we have some kind of teen court in Prince George's County. There are programs that they can get sent to, but if they're not brought in, then they're not going to get help. You know, they have to be charged in order to get help. Just like you were saying, the guy who committed a crime stole a car so he could get into a program. When there are people who don't do it to get into a program, but they get caught doing a crime and it's serious. So having a gun is serious. And that person needs to be brought in, they need to be charged, and then the judge can figure out how to dispense with that person to make sure they get into the right program to get help. I'm not saying you're gonna lock them up for 20 years, I'm not like that. But we need to have the ability to get our hands on them and get some help for that person, and not just kind of wave it away. So it's, I just know as a mother, when somebody gets caught doing something the first time, it's not the first time they did it. And we need to cut off that behavior with a quickness.
You know, we've talked about a number of things this morning where there are really tough choices that we're going to have to make as a community. One is that, like the schools. There was a period where metal detectors and school resource officers were controversial, and people wanted them out of the schools. And I'm just talking about like a couple of years ago. I think there's a push back now to get them back in, especially from teachers. By the way, our second oldest son was a school teacher for 4 years, and he got out. So there's a second story there. But that's one of them. Another one is trying to get guns off the streets. Well, one of the things police officers do to do that is the suburban version of stop and frisk. And that's where they stop cars. I call them pretense stops, because generally that's what they are. And by pretense, I mean, they're not really trying to stop the car because it's speeding or it rolled through a stop sign or rolled through a red light. They're stopping it because, frankly, it's a young black or brown male, and they want to get in the car. And when they stop them, and how you know it's a pretense search is because instead of just writing a ticket and moving on, they ask for consent to search the car, right? Oh, and by the way, there's entire units of the police department that are assigned to do this. DC, I think they call them the Gun Interdiction Task Force in DC. So, you know, now a lot of folks think that's a good thing because it does get guns off the street, but there's mixed feelings about it because you know, the constitutional issues that go with that. First-time gun offenders is the same kind of category. You know, we've gone back and forth as a community and as a nation about what to do with that the first time. I think for juveniles, I think you really do have to be careful about going straight to incarceration of some kind, even for juvenile facilities, because what I think we found, and you know, this is back when we had Cheltenham still up and running. Sometimes the kids came out sicker and slicker, just to be candid about it. And so maybe that's not the right way to go. For all of them, you try and get them into programs where you can redirect them. And those need to be stiff programs. Sometimes these kids, you might need to have, the ankle bracelet and stuff, so you have surveillance on them, keep close eye on it. Some of them, are gonna reoffend, and depending on what the reoffense is, that's when it turns into the explosive public thing. Like, let's say the next offense is a carjacking or a murder. Well, Judge so-and-so or state's attorney or U.S. attorney so-and-so, why did this guy get out with it? So those are tough choices we have to make. I think we're striking the balance, at least in Prince George's, in the right way. You don't want to try and throw away the key the first time, but we're going to have to understand that there's going to be blow-ups with that, and we're going to have to weather those storms. When the kid comes out, and he was in a program, but then he goes out and carjacks or shoots somebody, we can't let the pendulum swing all the way back just based on one or two cases. We have to be really careful about trying to stay on track and follow evidence-based approaches to criminal justice reform. And this is the last thing I'll say on this too. There's a community component to this too. That question linked up to the other question that was asked a few minutes ago. Why does the kid have the car, or the gun on the floor of the car or in the jacket? And a lot of times, when you talk to them, as state's attorney, I didn't talk to him as the case was coming through. I did end up, when I started doing reentry work, talking to these guys afterwards. And what they would tell you was, I didn't want to carry a gun. I felt like I had to because of some situations. And I'm in one scenario here, one that happened when I was state's attorney. There was a beef going on between two groups. One guy was walking down the street. He did not have a gun. The guys that were mad at him saw him. They did have guns. They jumped out of the car and they chased him down and killed him. Right? This is in the Forestville area. So the message that sent out to those kids in that community and young adults, I guess I better carry, right? So if we want to make sure that we're stepping on the individuals that are carrying guns, we need to make sure as a community, and this is law enforcement, but it's also the intervention and prevention stuff we just talked about a few minutes ago, we've got to be trying to address the group aspect of that too, right? Because you can't just ignore the context. So if we don't have programs and strategies, and this includes enforcement strategies, and in fact, the next one of these I want to target more of this concept here. It's got to look at the bigger picture, because that's the context that these kids find themselves in, and they know that if they're going to survive, they have to adjust to whatever those circumstances are. We can't act like all of them are living in Potomac or Bethesda or Mitchell, right? So I'll stop.